Enjoy historical stories on the History Fix platform. Explore movies, short films, and documentaries. Addressing Gettysburg podcast fans receive an extra $5 off the first year's annual subscription. Sign up at historyfix.com and use promo code Gettysburg. Every subscription includes a 7-day risk-free trial. Escape into history with History Fix.
The 1863 civilians of Gettysburg were reluctant witnesses to the Great Battle. Join Ken Rich, the man in the red shirt, for his historic town walking tours. You could book these tours by emailing ken@gettysburgtownhistory.com. That's ken@gettysburgtownhistory.com. And when you're in town, look for the guy in the red shirt.
Want the freshest cup of coffee in Gettysburg? Then visit 82 Cafe at 82 Steinway Avenue. They roast all of their coffee in-house and have a full coffee bar to keep you caffeinated during your visit. Check them out at www.raggededgerc.com for their menu and shipping options and their freshly roasted coffee. Use promo code Hancock for 10% off your order. That's 82 Cafe at 82 Steinway Avenue across from the Dobbin House or raggededgerc.com.
This episode of Addressing Gettysburg is brought to you in part by me, audiobook narrator Mike Scott. Narrator of Savis Beattie's Bloody Autumn, the Shenandoah Valley campaign of 1864, and Unlike Anything That Ever Floated, the Monitor and Virginia and the Battle of Hampton Roads. If you are an author or publisher interested in having your titles produced as audiobooks, or even just in learning more about the process, give me a shout. You can find my contact info on my website, MikeScottVoice.com. That's MikeScottVoice.com.
And Civil War Trails. It's the world's largest open-air museum, and they offer over 1,300 sites across 6 states. Drive the Gettysburg campaign turn by turn, paddle to Frederick Douglass's birthplace, or hike to remote earthworks and artillery positions. Visit civilwartrails.org to request a brochure and explore their interactive map. Follow Civil War Trails and create some history of your own.
All free episodes of Addressing Gettysburg are brought to you by our sponsors and our patrons over at patreon.com/addressinggettysburg. To become a sponsor, send an email to matt@addressinggettysburg.com. And to be a patron, go to patreon.com/addressinggettysburg today. And we thank you in advance.
Good afternoon, everybody. Good afternoon. Good to see you all. Thank you for being here at Gettysburg National Military Park for the next installment of our Winter Lecture Series. We are very fortunate to have with us today historian John Heiser, a name no doubt familiar to many of you. A native of Raleigh, North Carolina, John began his career with the National Park Service in 1976 as a seasonal interpretive ranger at Fredericksburg and Spotsylvania National Military Park. To our great fortune, he came to Gettysburg in 1980, and over the course of his career has worked as a seasonal interpretive ranger, assistant to the chief park historian, draftsman in the facility management division, and in 1997, John transferred to the Division of Interpretation and Education at Gettysburg as historian, where he managed the park's research library, answering visitor requests, providing research support to staff, licensed battlefield guides, public researchers. He has been a mentor to dozens of rangers and historians and a source of knowledge and guidance to countless authors and students of the battle, myself included. Though he retired in 2020, we are honored to have him back today for the Winter Lecture Series, so please join me in welcoming John Heiser.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Can everyone hear me okay? Yeah. Okay, first, thank you to the National Park Service and the Gettysburg Foundation for inviting me to come back to speak. I don't know why they did. They must have been desperate, but it's really it's an honor, seriously, to be able to return and give a program this afternoon. The second thing to be aware of is I have a terrible cold. So if I'm coughing and hacking and rolling around the floor, throwing up my intestines, don't be surprised. I'll get over it. I'll get through it. So just bear with me if I start coughing in the middle of all of this. I'll do my best to try to get through it. One of the things that my Park Service career has always interested me, actually long before that, was what happened here in 1913 while we struggled to study and understand the Battle of Gettysburg and all the influences and interpretations of it, and in some cases the fantasies about it. One event that occurred here 50 years after that battle does not really get a lot of press. It was kind of a big thing at the time, but then it quickly fades away, and is kind of forgotten in the memory of the history of Gettysburg National Military Park. And I have to admit, when I was a 6-, 7-year-old kid in Raleigh, North Carolina, in my elementary school, one of the books on the history shelf was the state report of the reunion in 1913. What fascinated me about that was the long, big pictures you could pull out, fold out, all these Civil War veterans walking around the battlefield in these meetings, cheering, singing, and it just thrilled me that how could these guys who tried to kill each other 50 years before now return to the same battlefield where they had suffered so much and lost so many friends and comrades. So I started looking into this more and more. But to put the context, to put it all into the context of where the Great Union stood in 1913, let's get this on. We have to look at America at the turn of the century. And these are some of the little, I say, bywords up here, my phrases of personalities, things that were going on at that time. Between the years of 1898 and 1913, America was changing dramatically. There's nothing that unites people more than a common enemy. In 1898, it was the Spanish-American War. You had Union and former Confederate officers serving side by side in the war, fighting in Cuba and in the Philippines. If it wasn't that, it was the rise of communism. It was the anarchists in America that were rising up. Nothing binds people more together than having a common enemy. And those three things, I think, really made America change quite a bit. But it was under the leadership of William McKinley and later President Theodore Roosevelt that now the United States of America wasn't just a power on the continent of North America, we were becoming an international power. Politically, globally, socially, America was changing dramatically. And what happened in that 10 to 15 year period, America changed completely. We were an industrial might around the world. In 1907, 1908, Roosevelt sent the United States fleet around the world, the Great White Fleet. This is when all the battleships were painted white. And if anything, it rivaled the British power, the French power of the sea. No one had seen anything like that. No one had any idea that the American Navy was so large, so huge, and so just incredible. So it was a political thing to do, but it also showed we are not to be toyed with by any foreign nation. And I think a lot of that pride stuck with the people living in this country at that time. America was changing dramatically, and there was a rise in pride, patriotism, and many other things that was making America great. But people also were looking back to what had happened 50 years before. Battlefields are being preserved. Gettysburg National Military Park had been established in 1895. Chickamauga, Chattanooga, Shiloh. Many of the other battlefields now were national parks, national military parks, national battlefields, under the direction of the United States War Department. So when the Civil War commemoration is coming around in 1911, what are we going to do about it? As far as the other battlefields are concerned, there's talk about maybe having reunions or get-togethers, commemorations there. But the big one is really going to be Gettysburg. And in 1908, this man, Henry Heiser, former lieutenant colonel of the 150th Pennsylvania, approached Governor Stewart of Pennsylvania with a proposal that at Gettysburg to commemorate the battle, we invite all of the surviving Gettysburg veterans back and camp on the battlefield. Not just Union, but also Confederate as well. And Governor Stewart saw this as a great idea, a great thing that the Pennsylvania state or Commonwealth of Pennsylvania could host these veterans on the battlefield. And Heiser had a lot of influence with the Pennsylvania Department of the Grand Army of the Republic. It was the Organization of Union Veterans. And he pursued this idea with the governor. The governor agreed, and about the following 6 months, 7 months later, formed a committee to look into the idea of having a mutual anniversary celebration, commemoration, and encampment on the battlefield of Gettysburg. Nothing else like this had ever been tried before. There had been mutual reunions here before, the first in 1887, with members of the Philadelphia Brigade Association, here in the white pith helmets, and members of the Pickets Division Association first met on the battlefield and shook hands over the stone wall, which only a couple years before they tried to kill each other over. So mutual reunions here was not a brand new idea. There have been some others on a smaller scale, maybe a Union general coming back, Confederate general coming back to visit the battlefield and tell these stories. But for the most part, there had never been something this large on this grand a scale. Things like this just don't happen in a vacuum. There's a lot to be considered here. Logistically, how are you going to get the veterans here? How are you going to feed them? How are you going to shelter them? What are you going to do for the couple of days that they're here? The Pennsylvania Committee started working on this project right away in 1909. And for the next 6 months, they worked straight ahead and then also proposed that there's no way the state can afford to do this on its own. It has to be a federal issue as well. A Senate committee is formed in 1909 under Pennsylvania Senator George Stewart, not George Stewart, George T. Oliver. And Oliver will kind of ramrod this through Congress to get appropriations and support from then the War Department, today's Department of Defense, as well as other agencies, like he also approaches the Red Cross and the others to help support this idea of a grand reunion here at Gettysburg. So you've got the Pennsylvania Anniversary Commission now working with the Federal Gettysburg Commission. The two commissions are going back and forth deciding what to do, and in the planning process, the Federal Commission will contact all of the northern states, all the southern states, and have representatives of each of those come to meet at Gettysburg and discuss what we're going to do for this great reunion in 1913, the idea for the plan. One of the requirements for this reunion was that there's no way that the federal government nor the state could afford to buy train fare for all the veterans. So it was decided that each state would then provide its own train fare to the veterans from those states to come to Gettysburg. And in the case of Pennsylvania, there were probably around 8,000, 9,000 veterans they could think of that were Gettysburg veterans, including several who were former Confederate veterans. Well, we could buy train fare for them. That would be a problem. New York and some of the other states also latched on that idea, and as the proposal built, the other states also joined in. James Schoonmaker, former colonel of the 14th Pennsylvania Cavalry, was the chairman of the Pennsylvania Commission and worked with several others, almost all Gettysburg veterans, as far as the planning, the logistics of how the state was going to manage this and where they're going to find the land at Gettysburg to set up this camp for the veterans that would eventually come. They weren't really sure in that early planning whether it would be 20,000, 30,000, possibly 40,000 veterans were going to come. They really had no idea. So the planning was kind of going back and forth, and that's why they needed the federal support. In 1910 was the first meeting of the state representatives from all the states and some of the territories here at Gettysburg. And if you look up there, you'll see a real, these are all old men by now. We're talking almost 50 years after the Battle of Gettysburg. But the most distinguished and most outstanding one of them all is seated right down in the front row, right in the middle. Anybody know who that is? Dan Sickles. You cannot miss him. But Sickles was a driving force in Congress, former congressman, now retired, but he's still working close with the State Department of GAR, or the New York State Department of GAR, and he was a large proponent in New York State promotion for the idea of a grand reunion as well. The commission met here for 2 days in 1910, and things seemed to be going pretty well. There was indeed a little bit of friction at the meeting. And some of that was not so much between the old veterans themselves, but a couple of things that were said in the opening of the meeting about the causes and the politics of the war. They decided at that point, we've got to leave that out, because this is something bigger than old bitterness and old divisions that may have caused the war or may have been a result of the war. What we've got to do now is think of this as a national jubilee. And if you look here at the bottom to the left, plans for the 50th anniversary, down at the very bottom, this is the general plan. They're going to have 3 days of celebration, July 1st, 2nd, 3rd, but the 4th is going to be the National Day of a Peace Jubilee. A peace jubilee. Basically, it comes back to the point of reunification. The United States is now reunified. Are the veterans going to buy into that? I think that's the main question, the main difficulty that the Commission has. There's a lot more to be hammered out. I also want to add, too, on these state commissions, there are some others that are, the names are very familiar to you. Evander Law, Elijah Hunt Rhodes, Joshua Chamberlain, another hero of Gettysburg, Felix Robertson, commander of the Texas Brigade at Gettysburg, And then John Page Nicholson, who was the head of the Park Commission here at Gettysburg, Civil War veteran of the 26th Pennsylvania. So there were additional meetings to be held in Adams County as well as in Philadelphia, Washington, D.C., and finally back in Gettysburg for the next 2 or 3 years. A lot of this was hammering out the support of who was going to support what they were going to do at the reunion to support the veterans that were coming. And again, the numbers were looking at around 40,000 or so. But the question came up too in 1912, would the Confederate veterans support a mutual reunion like this? Would the Confederate veterans want to come back to a place that meant so much more to the Union? They thought to the South. There was a lot of politicking that went on for about 6 to 7 months prior to the commission meeting in 1912 with the GAR and the heads of UCV. And at the time, it was Commander-in-Chief Irvin Walker who listened to everything everybody had to say. And he agreed that this is much larger than holding the old bitterness in our hearts. There was more to this, coming together a former foe on this battlefield than what people were saying. And there was quite a bit of consternation editorials in some of the Southern newspapers, especially, against any sort of mutual reunion. But Walker addressed the crowd, and he sent this message out to the UCV Post that we've been offered by the state of Pennsylvania and the Union veterans the hand of peace and amity with such cordiality, fairness, and consideration they should know it and should accept and grasp it. On each day, all such veteran soldiers shall be official guests and shall be provided seats at all official functions. Comrades, is that not true comradeship? Let us bury deep and forever all bitterness, but never fail to perpetuate the glorious history of that record of high duty superbly done by you in your young manhood. And the point there was being that we served our state. It may have been the lost cause, a losing cause, but we served our state as young men should. We went to defend our homes. And now it's time to celebrate something larger, which is this United States of America. So support for the encampment, so much of it was going to come from the federal authorities. The U.S. Army, Quartermaster Subsistence and Medical would supply equipment, food, water, everything else for the great camp that would be established on the south side of Gettysburg. Along with that was the 5th United States Infantry and the 15th United States Cavalry in attendance for demonstrations and to guard the camp and other logistical supplies. A little side note, a young lieutenant in the 15th U.S. Cavalry was named George S. Patton Jr. That name familiar with anybody? He didn't look like George C. Scott, I can tell you that. Patton's diary, his entry is actually a little bit disappointing. He just thought these guys were a bunch of boring old men. He really didn't think very much of them during his time here. The Pennsylvania National Guard, though, would step in to support the guests of Pennsylvania, guard the governor's camp, which was at Gettysburg College, on the grounds of Gettysburg College today. Pennsylvania State Police provide traffic control in Adams County and camp security. The American Red Cross, which was very important, provide medical support alongside the United States Army medical team. The Red Cross would actually have posts out on the park itself. In case somebody got in distress, they could handle somebody right there and right then. And brand new to this was the Boy Scouts of America. They'd only been formed maybe about 10 years before this. The Scouts, all from posts around, or Scout troops in Adams County, York County, Harrisburg area, would come here. About 358 Scouts would come as escorts and guides for the veterans themselves. So as the plans came together, this is the camp that was designed to be erected on the southwest side of Gettysburg. And it was fortunate that right through the middle of it was this railroad line. So I get this railroad line that ran right through the middle of it, the Gettysburg-Harrisburg Railroad, ran down behind the big round top, little round top, where it ended. It was perfect for bringing in supplies, logistics, and it was designed, they would put a platform there so that the special trains bringing veterans in could also drop the veterans off right in the middle of camp. If they could not accommodate on this rail line, then they would drop them at the rail stations in town, but get them out to the camp. And you'll notice the camp is designed with the Confederates here adjacent to West Confederate Avenue, all the federal Union veterans here in the big camp adjacent to the Emmitsburg Road. They were separated by the railroad, but really the problem was, and I'll get this later,
problem was keeping the veterans off the railroad. They always want to go back and forth and visit their old former foes. There's a lot of going back and forth here. So the camp was laid out and designed. And what's interesting about the Great Camp is the United States Army laid this out. They installed underground water lines. Ingeniously, they had water running to each company street. There was a faucet at the end of each street, so the veterans and the cookhouses could get the water right away. There were sanitation stations at the end of every company street, as well as in town for the use of the veterans and guests. And sanitation stations, some of them actually had running water in them. They weren't just a hole in the ground. Or they also had electric lights run through the camp itself, which made it brilliant, really lit it up at night. That way no one would get lost. Ingeniously, they put in ice pits. There were about a dozen of these, what they call bubbling ice water fountains, off the water lines. They put in ice pits. The pipes ran into these ice pits, and then you could just get fresh drinking cold water, even on a very hot day, right there off these water fountains throughout the camp. You'll notice that the tents, these are the new Army tents at that time. They were designed to accommodate 12 soldiers. At the reunion, they would accommodate 8 veterans per tent. Each veteran would have a cot, blanket. Each tent would have 2 wash basins, as well as candles, lanterns for at night, which were replenished as they needed them. This is a great view from the Millen House across what is now Colt Park today, but that is Cemetery Hill there in the background. The large flag up here to the right is the Army headquarters there on the Emmitsburg Road. It's changed quite a bit today, but you can see how the tents are laid out like that, and right through the middle, there runs the railroad. The other amenities to the camp, and there are quite a few. Veterans who were there and wrote about this said there was not a fly to be found. And that's pretty remarkable. You had that many people encamped in an area with waste, leftover food, all these other things. You think there'd be flies everywhere. Never a problem. The Army was very efficient about picking up all their refuse during the day and at evening. They emptied latrines out, made sure they were clean and sanitary. Ingeniously, they built 6 of these large water towers on stilts around the camp, and all 6 of them provided enough water pressure to keep these bubbling water fountains running. They didn't have to have extra pumps to pump water into the camp itself. That's pretty remarkable as far as engineering is concerned, even at that time. There are other things about the camp that they provided. Escorts out to the camp itself from town. If the veterans were feeble and couldn't really get around very well, they would provide them with at least a wagon or a cart to get them here and there. So there were a lot of things about the camp that really impressed the designers and the veterans themselves once they got there. Last but not least was the Great Tent, pitched on the southern end of the camp, out in the field of Pickett's Charge. It accommodated between 8 to 10,000 veterans at a time. And this is where they would have the ceremonies, July 1st, 2nd, and 3rd. Ceremonies would be held about noon, last till 2 or 3 o'clock in the afternoon. And between that time, other departments could then host reunions in there or meetings. They would actually have these dividers, could divide it all off. But once everybody got in there, you can only imagine on a hot summer day, it was pretty steamy. So they did have some problems with air ventilation, but this is where all of the ceremonies took place there in the Great Tent out there in the field. So, as it's coming down to the wire, they're planning for 40,000 veterans. And in April 1913, they finally sent out invitations to all the northern states and the southern states for your veterans to come to Gettysburg. The states will supply the train fare, pay for the train fare to Gettysburg and back. The enthusiasm is so high, though, that all of a sudden, the Pennsylvania Commission is overwhelmed. They're planning on 40,000 veterans. The state of New York is limited to 8,000. But at that time, they already have 11,000 registered to come, and another 800 on a waiting list. There are veterans from Pennsylvania who said, heck with this invitation stuff, I'm going. You can't stop me. And I think one of the most interesting stories about this is that there's a story of one old veteran who lived in his daughter's home in eastern PA. He was going to go to the reunion, hell or high water. His daughter said, absolutely not. She and her husband locked him in his room in the second floor of the home. So the next morning they go up to get him up to come down for breakfast. He's not there. They look out here. He's climbed out the trellis, out the second floor window, taking his bag, and they find him a day or two later with his comrades at the reunion at Gettysburg. That's pretty remarkable. The enthusiasm from the South was equal in many ways. There was a large group from North Carolina that came, about not quite 600 veterans, I think, from North Carolina asked to come. And with that, there were another 50 that also wanted to come, but they could not get train fare. They paid their own way to come. So before they knew it, they had not 40,000, but 50,000 veterans are going to come out here on this field. There was a lot of scrambling at the last minute in May as they were erecting the great tents out there and erecting the great camp. There's a lot of scrambling for extra appropriations to cover the food, supply, transportation, medical, everything else. The money did come through, thanks to Senator Oliver, really. The money came through, and by June 26th, everything was ready to go. Now, June 26th to the 28th was the Pennsylvania Department, the GAR, had their reunion here. This kind of threw a monkey wrench into the works, because initially they wanted to have their reunion July 1st and 2nd. Well, they can't have at the same time the great reunion's going on, because now you're really going to be overcrowded. And there's 20,000 Pennsylvania veterans that are coming. So, okay, we'll do this. Pennsylvania, you can have your reunion, 26th to 28th. You leave on the 29th. On the 29th and 30th, other veterans are going to come in. So, 20,000 veterans show up. June 26th, some of them occupy the great camp. Others are staying in town and other places. Some of them just decide to stay over. Hey, this is a lot of fun. So June 29th, when the trains start rolling in, the camp is already half full. More trains will come in on June 30th until beginning about 4 o'clock in the morning until 10:30 that night. Trains keep rolling in, the veterans keep discharging. And it's amazing that all of this worked so well. The timetables worked. There was nobody that was lost. When the veterans got off their trains, their special trains, they were lined up, told where to go for the state section. If you're from the state of Washington or the state of Oregon or California, New York, wherever, you knew exactly where to go. You knew where your tent assignment was. And the Boy Scouts and the National Guardsmen that were there, some of the Armies personnel, escorted these veterans so they could get all registered and signed in to their particular tents. And man, they were really impressed by all of this. They were impressed by the reception. As many said, they got off the trains, told to line up, and amidst cheers from the people around them, they marched off to the company streets. Now, every man could only bring what he could carry in his hand. Just a small satchel, maybe a change of underwear, a clean shirt, and that was it. So after a while, sure, it got a little hot, a little smelly, but no one really cared at that point. You're all outside, right? But the real point was hygiene and care of the veterans themselves. There was a prediction at one point by medical officials, you can't do this. You're going to lose thousands of men to the heat and exhaustion out here on a hot summer's day. They're going to die like flies. And one man, whose name escapes me thankfully, proposed, you better bring about 300 or 400 coffins and have them stacked up because you're going to need them. Well, that makes the place look like a death camp, right? You don't want to make it look like a death camp. Come on. The reality was, these hardy old souls, average age in their early 70s, kind of equal to our Vietnam veterans today, they were tough birds. They had survived the Civil War. They had survived 50 years of civilian life, a very rough life in the Western Plains, in the upstate New York, in the Northeast, in the South. They survived, and here they are, like a boys' weekend, away with their old Army buddies on a battlefield that had changed from a battlefield to a national military park. And if anything, right away, there was this feeling of like getting the electric shock. This is incredible. All of the accounts I read from the veterans that come to Gettysburg is the same thing. And the one thing that amazes them most is this is something that's never happened before. Robert L. Drummond, this photograph, is a veteran from New York in the 111th New York. During the Civil War, he fought at Gettysburg, fought many of the battlefields, had been a prisoner of war twice, and in 1864 was captured, wound up at Salisbury Prison War Camp in North Carolina. Survived the war, went back to Europe, became a fairly successful businessman, and wrote quite a long, lengthy journal about his excursion here to Gettysburg in 1913. And remember the words that are right here. that before you is a great encampment of men that have never been assembled upon the face of the globe before. He doesn't just point out these are Gettysburg veterans because the reunion had been open to all veterans of the Civil War. It didn't matter that you served the Army of the Potomac or the Army of the Tennessee or the Army of the South or the Army of the James. You're welcome to come. And that was a state requirement. That was a requirement that actually came down from the state committees to the National Committee, and they agreed to it. So you've got a real mix of veterans now in this big, huge camp. And as he closes out this one part of the account that day, he said, 50 years ago, these men came suddenly and unexpectedly upon this same town lying among the hills of Pennsylvania, the pride and the strength of their young manhood, fired by a lofty patriotism, nearly 200,000 of them. They fought under great leadership for high stakes and to establish what both sides believed to be great principles. 50 years ago, they came as men of war, and now they come as men of peace. They come in the interest of a reunited country under one flag by special invitation of the state of Pennsylvania as friends and brothers meeting upon one common ground in the cause of one common humanity. So you've got them all in the camp, got them all sheltered. How do you feed these guys? You think you're just going to get a slab of meat, Spam on a piece of bread? What's remarkable about logistics of the Great Reunion, to me, is that the United States Army provided hot meals 3 times a day for 5 straight days to all of these veterans. And at one point, we believe around 54,000 veterans encamped in the Great Camp, as well as places in town, and at a place called Meadville, which is a private Union camp over on Cemetery Hill. The United States Army provided hot meals, and they were good. In the morning, it was eggs, bacon, fresh fruit, toast. There was a camp bakery, one camp bakery that operated 24 hours a day for 7 days straight, to provide bread for all of the mess tents. And at one point, one veteran wrote, he never saw bread stacked so high. The loaves of bread were stacked at least 12 feet high, and they just farmed it out and took it out to the mess tents in the morning. But all the meals were good, and the men had 3 hot meals a day. And sure, the lines look a little long, as you see here, but they're old soldiers. They're used to this kind of stuff. It didn't bother them at all. And some of the funny part about this is one veteran wrote, the best part about the reunion was standing in line and talking to men you haven't talked to in almost 50 years and sharing stories as you're lining up for your meal. So Union and Confederate veterans are now on the battlefield of Gettysburg, and they also invade the town. There was always some consternation or anticipation. How are these former foes going to meet each other? How are they going to greet each other here on this battlefield where so much had been lost, so much had been placed at stake? And what really was remarkable to a lot of them was that they would just clasp hands, shake like old soldiers would. How are you? How are you? Nice to meet you. Good to see you, Red. Good to see you, Yank. And this went on for days on end during the entire reunion. There are press photos taken in town, like this one here, of Union veterans welcoming Confederate veterans to the town of Gettysburg. But many other similar scenes also occur out in the battlefield itself. One veteran from North Carolina wrote that they're all from Rockingham, North Carolina, and after breakfast that morning, they start walking out to the field. They want to walk out to the park, and they go by the Union camp. And some old Yankee soldier yells to them, "Hey, Johnny, you guys got any tobacco?" "Well, we got plenty of tobacco. You have any coffee?" "Well, sure, we got plenty of coffee. Come on over." So the 2 groups met together and had a great old time, and I have no doubt passed a small bottle. There was a real problem. They said from the beginning, health officials talked about this. We can't have all these guys together on a boys' weekend because they're going to drink themselves silly. Well, the bar tavern owners, everybody, they had a killing that weekend, let me tell you. They did really, really well. And it was a concern, but as one veteran wrote, too, he never saw a drunk soldier, a drunk veteran, stumbling around the street or stumbling through the camp. Not a single one. And some of these guys, sure, they drank, they smoked their pipes. They didn't really think about it. It was their way of life. The health officials were still concerned because of the conditions, the heat, and everything else was going out there. And these men, once again, they're in their 70s, 80s, some in their late 60s. How is that all going to affect them? They just did not want them to drink themselves crazy and get in trouble, especially with related to alcohol they could get here at Gettysburg. Alcohol was banned from the Great Camp, by the way. Sure it was. But what impressed so many of them, again, was that here we are gathered on this battlefield, and there's 50,000 of us from all of these armies, and it's something greater than that. This had never happened before, and we're all part of it. And many of them feel, a veteran from New York wrote that never before had he seen his former foe so happy and jolly. He always believed that they'd be morose, downcast, but they were just as happy as could be. And they always welcomed him no matter he went by. Wherever he saw a Confederate veteran, a hand was thrust out to shake his hand because he was a Union veteran. The only conflict that occurred happened on July 1st when Governor Mann of Virginia and some of the other Confederate officials, UCV officials, were welcomed to the Confederate camp. There was a large Confederate flag that was unfurled, and a parade occurred on West Confederate Avenue. And some of the Union veterans saw that flag, and it really upset them, because that's what they had fought against for 4 years. And now this flag is being displayed right beside the flag of the United States. It really bothered them. But others had calmer heads, said, let's just pass it by. This is not really important. There's more important things to be taken care of here, apart from worrying about a Confederate flag being flown to welcome the governor of Virginia and others. The 3 days all had a theme. July 1st was Veterans Day, and it opened rather warm in the mid-80s, so it was going to be a very hot day that day. Still, the great tent filled up, and at noon the ceremony began. Governor John Tenner of Pennsylvania got up to welcome the veterans, and he was interrupted by this man, H. Bennett Young. Bennett Young was the commander of the UCV at the time, and he wanted to welcome all of them and thank them by welcoming them with the rebel yell. And Miss Lucy Hill McGill, who was the great-granddaughter, I think, of A.P. Hill, led the Confederate veterans into the rebel yell, echoing through the great tent. That must have been really something. But they welcomed the governor. The governor welcomed them back. There were several speeches that went on throughout that day. But I think one of the most provocative or ones that really stands out was the one by H. Bennett Young. Young had a really interesting military career. Captured during the war, he escaped, was part of the St. Albans, Vermont raid, 1864. He had quite an adventure. And in the aftermath of the war, he picked up all these losses and really made something of himself. He was really quite a gentleman, very stoic in some ways. But as he says here, I'm half a thousand miles away from home, but all the same, I am home. This is my home, this country of ours, America. There's no better guarantee of the perpetuity of this nation. And this assembly here today is the birth of what he called the New America. And you see that theme, New America, rolling through some other speeches by Southern veterans in the subsequent days. The rest of the afternoon, there was a parade of Union vets that night that just happened. A couple of vets started walking through the Union camp. They went through Pennsylvania to New York into the Michigan camp, and snaked their way up into the Confederate camp, followed by a band, playing all these martial tunes, and they had a real good time that evening, just kind of hamming it up with all the Southern veterans up in the camp. And finally, about 10 o'clock, the guards went up and said, you guys got to quiet down, go back to your tents. Taps is coming up. And they played taps at 10 o'clock, and the veterans all went back. There was a band concert that night by the 8th U.S. Infantry, provided a band concert for the veterans. So it was a very successful day. Now, July 2nd was the hottest day on record. It was 102 degrees that day. This is where heat really played an issue with a lot of the veterans' health. And in some, there was some 5,000 cases of heat exhaustion and sunstroke that day. So the medical tents, medical officers, and the Red Cross, they're very, very busy that day. But they still had the ceremony there in the Great Tent, beginning at about 11 o'clock that morning. Being Military Day, this was focused more on the United States military and the heraldry of the United States military, the United States Army, as well as how the Southern states played a role in that in kind of an out-and-out way as part of that heritage, that history. And the featured speaker was Lyndon Garrison, the Secretary of War. Garrison was a New Jersey lawyer, was 46 years old, I believe, at the time, was part of the Wilson administration. And unfortunately, he was very enthusiastic about the event. He was very progressive with the War Department, but he and Wilson fell out with each other, and eventually he resigned from being Secretary of War in 1916, just the advent of World War I, unfortunately. But Garrison really enjoyed his time here. He wrote later that this is one of the highlights of his career as Secretary of War, was welcoming and talking to the veterans here at Gettysburg in 1913. Here he is at headquarters with General Hunter Liggett, who was a commander of the Army contingent, commander of the camp here at Gettysburg. Liggett likewise had a stellar military career. West Pointer, had served as a lieutenant in the 5th U.S. Infantry until the war with Spain, had been a brigadier general of volunteers during the war, was chief of the occupation troops in Cuba in the aftermath. He reverted to major and was then promoted eventually to general in 1912, just in time for the Great Reunion. On June 30th, his vehicle got caught in traffic coming out of the Washington area, and he did not arrive here until much later at night, around 11:30 to 12. As they're coming up the Evansburg Road, he's about to turn to the camp. One of the guards staying there stops the car, and he says, "I'm General Liggett. I'm commander of the camp." And the guard says, "I can't let you pass. It's after taps. You have to be very quiet. I can't have your vehicles run through the camp." So sheepishly, General Liggett gets out of his car and walks to his tent, and that's it. That was his introduction to the Great Reunion. There was a second. Other events that happened that day, there was, I think of some of the other things that went on that day. There was a huge storm in the afternoon, about 2 or 3 o'clock, just as the ceremonies were starting to close down, came through, just very typical of the late summer storms here in Gettysburg. Usually about 4 or 5 o'clock, these storms roll through, rain, thunder, lightning, high winds, blew everything everywhere. But it actually cooled things off for a little bit that night. And that night there were parades, fireworks, other things going on. And once again, the health officials were concerned because the taverns and bars in Gettysburg were absolutely filled with veterans. They could not get them out. And there was a problem, too, with they were scared that suffragettes were going to invade the town of Gettysburg and attack the veterans. Well, remember, it was only a couple years before that a woman had actually been bold enough to smoke a cigarette on the street, and she was arrested. Yeah, can you believe that? July 3rd was Governor's Day. Many of the governors of all the northern and southern states came and spoke, or just made their presence. And Thomas Marshall, the Vice President of the United States, came. He was a Democratic governor of Indiana before being elected as Vice President under President Wilson. And very jovial man. He really enjoyed his time here. He enjoyed Washington. I think he's probably more famous for some of the things he may have said or did in Washington, D.C. as Vice President. But he did speak to the veterans. Told them once again, I think the key element here is we are a reunited people. Once again, the North and South. We're not North and South anymore. We're a reunited people. And that was the key part of his address that day. The President and the Vice President did not get along. As time went on, eventually Wilson had Marshall's office moved completely out of the White House across the street, and never again was the Vice President's office in the White House. They just did not get along at all. And Marshall was much more, I think, happy, told a lot of jokes compared to the very stoic Wilson. And if anything, he may be more famous for, there was a debate in Congress, and the senator was telling the Senate what America needed. America needed this, and America needed that. And Marshall spoke up and said, what the country really needs is a good 5-cent cigar. He's the one who said that. So the events were dismissed at about 3 o'clock that afternoon. And the highlight of that day, July 3rd, was going to be this meeting at the Bloody Angle of the members of the Philadelphia Brigade Association and Pickett's Division Association. About 300 vets, I think, of the Philadelphia Brigade and about 120 of Pickett's men were going to meet here at the Angle for a brief ceremony, trade flags, and that was going to be it. But more and more vets showed up, including members of Hall's Brigade and Harrow's Brigade, those regiments that had served there at the Angle on July 3rd. 50 years afterwards, here they meet.
At the same spot where 50 years before, at about the same time, they shot, bayoneted, and clubbed each other to death. It's really remarkable this happened. The men all lined up there. The Confederates, veterans, formed on the Emmitsburg Road and began their march across the open ground there up towards the angle. Now this is a posed photograph. It's not really, it was taken after the thing was over, but it gives you an idea of how high the wheat was and how high it was. And these old soldiers, they were walking across the field towards the angle and their former foe. A man named Claude Leelard from New York was a veteran. He was sitting under the copse of trees with some other Union veterans when he heard the shouting starting and everyone get in a line, everyone form up and on and on. And he says, up from the Gettysburg Road comes a real column of Confederates. It doesn't look as the other column looked. Most of the men have canes, some have crutches. There are empty sleeves by the dozen. They come up across the field. One of the band in front of them playing Dixie. Then we heard it. It was the rebel yell. Across the field it came, smiting our ears with piercing intensity, a spine-chilling, blood-chilling cry. Slowly the line of men advanced in good formation. They brandished their canes and crutches. The more agile ones aided those less able to maintain their place. Nearer and nearer they came until they were close enough for us to distinguish their faces. It was at this point that the Yankees broke from behind the stone wall and rushed at their ancient enemies. Now they fell upon each other, not in mortal combat, but reunited in brotherly affection and love. Soldiers forgive. It's only civilians who cherish hatred throughout the years. Things got a little out of whack there for a couple of minutes. There was a lot of handshaking and tears being shed, but things settled down. J. Hampton Moore, representative from Pennsylvania, spoke to the vets and told them some kind words, how America was reunited, thanks to them, their sacrifices and their duties done. And he was very impressive speech. It's amazing he could be heard with this big crowd of guys all standing around, all yakking and talking, but he spoke right there at the very angle today. I do know that spot, the 71st Pennsylvania Monument, is just off to the left of the photograph, right out of the view. And the ceremony of the crossing of the flags, the flag of the Second Corps crossed with the Confederate battle flag, and afterwards there were cheers that lasted for about 15 or 20 minutes, both sides yelling and carrying on. And just like that, the charge was over. The ceremony ended. And for the last time, very last time, the veterans of Pickett's Division Association and the veterans of the Philadelphia Brigade Association left the battlefield of Gettysburg, headed back to the great camp. Not without taking this photograph. And I know this is very familiar to a lot of people. This is often has to do with the reunions here at Gettysburg. It's a great shot of Union Confederate veterans shaking hands. In the background, you see the great tent along the Emmitsburg Road, were part of the great camp. What's interesting about this, it's been passed down through time as these are veterans of Pickett's Division Association shaking hands with members of the Union Army. Well, all these fellows on the left are indeed members of the Philadelphia Brigade Association. The officials on the right, though, only two of them were actually members of Pickett's Division Association. The others were either leaders of the Texas Division of the UCV, several others. They just filled in because they had the right uniforms on. But it's a good press shot. It's a good press photo. And it means a lot. And I think it's very significant. It's like the 1975 or 75th anniversary photograph of the two veterans shaking hands over the wall there on north of the 14th Connecticut Monument. It means a lot. President Wilson was kind of going to blow this off. He'd been invited to come speak at the reunion, but he waffled and wasn't going to do it. Then he became under such criticism by Republicans in Congress that he acquiesced. And on June 30th, the Pennsylvania committee was contacted by the president's staff. He's going to come to Gettysburg and speak to the veterans. When could you fit him in? So they decided to let him come and speak then on July 4th, which was the day of the Peace Jubilee. And importantly that day, they were going to lay a cornerstone to a peace memorial here at Gettysburg. That had been proposed by the veterans as far as back as 1910, 3 or 4 years before. They didn't really have a design for the monument. They didn't have funding for the monument. They're going to put up a cornerstone, at least mark the spot where a peace memorial would come here at Gettysburg. That was supposed to happen on July 4th. Things changed, not just because of Wilson, but other factors here. With the president coming, you've got to accommodate him. His train pulled into the camp at about 11 o'clock,
and escorted by these two veterans to the great tent. There was a brief pause at noon for a 48-gun salute and the playing of taps that waved from the great camp. This was the closing, really, of the great reunion. The president spoke to the veterans in the great tent for about 20 minutes. It was dismissed, and that afternoon, the train started rolling out back to their respective states to take the veterans home. It'd take almost 2 days for all the veterans then to finally get out of the camp and go back to their home states.
You've heard us promote various ways that you can help us keep the show going, but one way we haven't pushed too much is our sutlery at addressinggettysburg.com/shop. That's a shame because we have designs over there by talented artists like Ty DeWitt of 1863 Designs and Mike Stretch of the Heritage Depot. So now we're promoting it. Buying shirts, hoodies, mugs, and other items from our sutlery not only helps us keep the lights on, but it also helps guys like Ty and Mike, and it helps spread the word about the show every time you wear an item or you sip from your mug. So head over to addressinggettysburg.com/shop and grab some merch. It's the perfect Christmas gift for the Gettys nerd in your family. That's addressinggettysburg.com/shop.
For the Historian has a wide variety of titles, new and used, of military books from publishers like Osprey, Gettysburg Publishing, Stackpole, Savas Beatty, UNC Press, and more. I make it a point to go there once a week because I have new bookshelves to fill and I never know what treasures I'll find, and neither will you. They even have toy soldiers, model kits, games, children's books, and more. So stop by and check them out on your next visit to Gettysburg, or better yet, order right now online at forthehistorian.com and mention that you heard about them on Addressing Gettysburg in the Note to Seller box, and they will refund you your shipping. And if you call 717-685-5207 or stop by the store on your next visit and mention us, you'll get 20% off retail price. That's forthehistorian.com or 717-685-5207.
If you're a lover of history, then go to trhistorical.com. There you'll find apparel, decor, and gear, and our listeners will receive 10% off plus free shipping within the U.S. if you use promo code GBERG1863 at checkout. So take advantage of this deal at trhistorical.com. TR Historical, for the love of history.
Hey, Gettysburg business owners. Winter is just around the bend, and you know what that means. No tourists. But just because people aren't coming to you doesn't mean you can't bring your business to them. If you ship, you're still in the game. And if you're a seasonal business, the time to advertise for your next season is in the off-season when people are making their plans. So what's an affordable yet highly effective way of reaching those people? Well, it's not radio. It's not TV, and it's certainly not print. Step out of the Jurassic era of advertising and run an ad on Addressing Gettysburg. We just reached 1 million downloads, and we're growing by the tens of thousands every month. Beyond that, our audience is happy to support those who support their favorite podcast. So email sales@addressinggettysburg for more information about advertising on our show. We look forward to helping your business grow. That's sales@addressinggettysburg.com.
So when we talk about all the highfalutin things that went on during the reunion, I think most of us are always interested in what was the veterans' reaction. How did these guys get along? What did they say to each other? Did they write a lot about it? And they did. Quite a few wrote articles that wound up in newspapers here and there, scattered all over the place. Some wrote journals. A lot of them wrote letters to a daughter or a son or a grandson, letting them know what happened here at Gettysburg and their general impression of it. Veteran William Phillips was from the state of Washington, and he came out with others on a special train all the way from the state of Washington. And he was so impressed with when he got here of what happened to Gettysburg, how it transitioned, but still he could recognize so much of it. And he wrote to the paper, it all looked natural back there, except for the monuments and tablets and the trees that have grown up since the battle. It was the same old battlefield. I could pick out the landmarks, the place where we camped that night before it all started. Old Little Round Top and Seminary Ridge, and even a little gully in which we lay before Longstreet drove us out. I could almost trace my footsteps in the mud. The ones I made, I was making tracks away from the Confederates. As a member of the 11th Massachusetts, he'd been out there on the Emmitsburg Road line July 2nd. The regiment forced back and retreated to Cemetery Ridge, and basically he could walk that entire track. I have no doubt there are others that did the same thing. Many of them walking around, seeing where they had fought, but others sharing stories. And what's interesting is both Union and Confederate share stories back and forth of their experiences at the battle and at other places. As Robert Drummond, the 111th New York, recalled, at the reunion, he saw vets he had not seen in 50 years, some men from his old regiment. And he met his old sergeant, who he'd been at Salisbury Prisoner of War Camp with. And for a minute there, he had this vision. He remembered standing in line, the sergeant calling roll, and hanging out their meager rations for the day as they were prisoners. And they're standing there in their ragged uniforms, worn out and exhausted, thinking the war's never going to end, we're never going to get home. And there he was, the sergeant who had helped him and guided him through that whole time. And it was just like we talk about veterans with PTSD, very similar case there with Mr. Drummond. There are many honored guests here, and you can't talk about all the honored guests, Josh Richard and many others, without talking about this man. Dan Sickles, last surviving Corps commander of either army, was 92 years old, I believe, at this time, diabetic, suffering from a lot of ailments. He arrived with these 5 young ladies who were his nurses who took care of him while he was quartered there at the Rogers House for 2 days. And unfortunately, the Rogers House no longer stands. It was on the Emmitsburg Road. It depends on your whole perspective of this man. He had a very controversial career, but again, his remark that the whole battlefield is my monument is because he's the one that sponsored that legislation in 1895 to establish Gettysburg National Military Park when so few others would want to take the chance or even do it. No, he does not have a monument here. Does he deserve a monument here? That's up to debate. We can talk about that forever. But what we do know is his hand is on every last little piece of this battlefield where there is a New York monument or a tablet or anything related to the battlefield. His hand is on it. And for that matter, his hand's on a lot of other things too, but I won't go into that one. But one, excuse me. One gentleman, a news reporter, who observed the general at the Rogers House on that very, very hot afternoon, July 2nd, sitting out on the lawn in his Morris chair. One of the nurses trying to fan him to keep him cool, another one trying to light a cigar for him. And he was very sluggish, just kind of mumbled to himself. Veterans would come by to shake his hand. And he just kind of limply shake his hand, you know, this, that, blah, blah, blah. But I think of all the things that happened, though, was this photograph was taken that afternoon as a lot of the old veterans gathered around, waving their flags, and they all cheered. And maybe that's how we really should remember Dan Sickles, because despite all the controversies, he was really loved by the men and respected by those who came back here, not just as a celebrity, but also for the many things he did for the veterans, especially the veterans of New York. As far as the comrades in gray, these men came from a long way. Alabama, Florida. There are 303 Confederate veterans living in Pennsylvania that attended the reunion. Washington State, as well as Oregon, California, also had a very large contingent of Confederate veterans. You think, well, gosh, they'd all come to the South, wouldn't they? Many Southerners had left the South and gone out west, even gone north. There were 2 Southern veterans that came from the state of Vermont. And if anything, I think it was a curiosity. There was a fear for a long time, especially amongst the daughters and sons of these men, that they'd be brought to Gettysburg only to be ridiculed. And it was not that way. They were special guests, and in some ways were treated better and more highly regarded because there were so few of them, and because they were so unique in this sense, as being the former foe now come back to where they had fought a battle, had lost, but still had made themselves into what we call great Americans, that new America Reverend Walker talked about. As one veteran wrote, I went to the rebels' camp, and I found a jolly set of old boys I ever met. We had a very good time, and we told stories of wartime. 2 veterans took me around to show me where their battery had been, and talked about the guns that are still there today. I cannot write about the excitement I have had throughout 3 days here, especially talking amongst these old Johnnies. As Robert Drummond from New York also wrote, that never before he'd seen former enemies that were so friendly and so happy to see them. As one soldier wrote, I'm so glad I came here to shake your hand and not shoot you. I think they all shared that. The blue and the gray gathered together on the field, and that is what's remarkable about this. There was no fighting, there was no consternation, and sure, there were some disagreements, especially in some of the bars and taverns at night. It happens. You get a couple drinks in you don't want to fight about something. It did happen, but one remarkable story that occurred here, A.C. Smith, the 46th Virginia, was at the Angle on July 3rd, and was talking about what happened to him that day. He'd been seriously wounded and was laying just inside the stone wall. He thought he was going to die. And in the middle of all this, as things were starting to die down, this young Union veteran, young Union soldier, saw him, came up, dragged him out of the line of fire, gave him a drink of water, put him on his back, and carried him back to the field hospital behind Cemetery Ridge. As he's telling this story to his comrades, he said, if I only knew who that man was, I never saw him again. A few feet away was an old Union veteran with his hands in his pockets, listening to the story and listening to others. He came and said, that's a really interesting story, because I was here on July 3rd too, and I saw this very young Johnny laying there. I took pity on him. I just didn't want to leave him laying there. I gave him a drink of water from my canteen, and I carried him back to the field hospital. And sure enough, it was the same man who helped the other one. 50 years later, they met right there at the Angle where one had helped the other one. The story goes, too, of a Union Confederate veteran who agreed on July 1st they would have to have some sort of peace memorial of their own, personal idea, here at Gettysburg. They took a hatchet from the camp. On July 3rd, they went out to the Angle and buried it there. The ceremonial burying of the hatchet. No longer was the fighting over, the bitterness was gone. We all have to look forward to the past, look forward to the future, and not the past. And what I wish, if I had a time machine, I'd love to have gone back and listened to the music. They said the camps were filled with music throughout the day, into the night, not just the Army band playing, but also all the veterans who came with their fifes and drums. You could hear all of the songs all day long. As a veteran wrote, the music and singing at night drifted across the battlefield and camp, and it was a grand sound in an old soldier's heart. You can only imagine the way they felt about that. Some of them brought the relics of war. The man on the left, Sergeant Christian Cool, served in Company C of 31st Virginia. That's the jacket he wore home from Appomattox Courthouse. If you've seen the Ken Burns film, at the very end of it, they talk about Gettysburg. There's only about a minute of film that was taken here in 1913 that has survived. It's in the National Archives today. There's video of part of that film is Sergeant Cool wearing that jacket. And so he wore that jacket here to Gettysburg. To the right is T.J. Dackett, who was a young lieutenant in the 3rd South Carolina, and that's the hat he wore at Gettysburg. The bullet hole in the top received at the Battle of Chickamauga. And today the hat is in the Museum of the Confederacy. There are other relics that were brought here, too, by many men. The most famous, probably being infamous, being the flag of the 20th North Carolina. Iverson's brigade was captured on July 1st by members of the 97th New York. And in the retreat through town, the man bearing the flag was accosted by a young lieutenant, North Carolina lieutenant, who recognized the flag and tried to wrestle it out of the man's hands. So he got in a fight over it. The flag ripped right in half. The Union soldier took his half, ran to Cemetery Hill, and the Confederate soldier standing there with the other half in his hand. There was a contingent from the 97th New York on July 1st rather. They brought that piece of flag with them. They went up to the North Carolina camp and wanted to return it. And remarkably, the man who was the color bearer of the 20th North Carolina was there. He was 91 years old or something like that. He'd been the color bearer on July 1st. He's the one who was wounded, lost the flag, and they returned the piece of the flag to him. Now, supposedly, they put the flag back together. I don't know whatever happened to it. I'd love to know. I know it's not in the North Carolina State Archives. It's probably in somebody's attic somewhere. So check your attics, folks. But it was a grand time. And the veterans that left all had positive reviews of it. And we talk about the interaction, and I'm sure there are many who treated the others, former foes, with respect. And maybe they didn't love them. They couldn't get real close to them, couldn't say, we shared the same thing, we shared the same canteen. But at least they did respect it and respect other things that they stood for and why they fought, why they were soldiers. Because now they're old men. They saw something greater in the country than just what the war had meant. And actually, there were some things that happened during the reunion, a lot of fake relics being sold and shuffled on for all these guys. There was things that occurred. There was a fight in the Gettysburg Hotel one night. A man named Henry Baker, who was a veteran of the 1st Pennsylvania Reserves, was sitting at a table in the Hotel Gettysburg. Right next to him was a 38-year-old lawyer who was complaining about Lincoln and talking about Lincoln. Lincoln this, Lincoln that, Lincoln da-da-da-da. You know how politics can get. Well, Baker took exception to this man's degrading of President Lincoln, got wrapped in the head with a cane. And this man jumped up with a knife, chased Baker all around the Hotel Gettysburg dining room. He knifed. 2 people tried to stop him, stuck a police officer in the street. They finally wrestled him to the ground, arrested him, and here he claimed to be the son of General Henry from Virginia, General Henry. Well, here he was. Indeed, he was the son of General Tazewell Henry, a Major Tazewell Henry, Confederate veteran, who was at the reunion. But his son, the man who did the knifing and was arrested, was actually a lawyer in Camden, New Jersey. Lawyers. And he got off of that with time served. It's okay, a little misunderstanding. The veterans of 1913, the press covered this so well. It was a remarkable reunion. The predictions were that thousands of veterans were going to be sick and died. Only 9 passed away, remarkably, and several of them from pre-existing conditions. There was one veteran who passed away just as he reached home in Washington State. Several others did the same thing, but for all of them, it was a remarkable point in time. And the press covered this so well, as now the Civil War is truly over. And they planned a peace jubilee at Appomattox Courthouse in 1915, but the courthouse was in ruins. It wasn't there anymore. The McLean House had been torn down, was sitting there as a big pile of bricks. So then they were going to switch it to Richmond. We'll have a peace jubilee in Richmond. Southern editors, newspaper editors, as well as the UDC were dead set against that because they saw that as a celebration of the fall of Richmond and the fall of the Confederacy rather than a celebration of a new America at the end of the Civil War. So the last big commemoration here in the United States was actually at Chickamauga, Chattanooga that fall. But they did not equal the numbers they did in Gettysburg that summer. And as time went on, the next couple of years, the influence of the Civil War veterans passed away slowly. Fewer and fewer were in Congress, fewer and fewer were in positions of influence, and now they're replaced by a new veteran, grandsons, great-grandsons, who now went off to Europe in 1917, 1918, to fight a brand new war. These were the new veterans. They replaced the old veterans. They became the relics of a long-lost period, long forgotten. I think this is from the Library of Congress. It's a great photograph. There's several others like this, the old veterans supporting the new ones, but never again would the man on the left, the gray beard, see a war like he'd seen compared to the young man on the right. The war he would see would be a brand new type of war with gas, shells that could flatten, destroy a city block, devastation, things that they could never recover from. But the legacy is still here on the battlefield of Gettysburg, and it's this memorial here. This was the wish of the veterans. This was the hope of the veterans in 1913 that did not occur until 25 years later. And it was kind of forgotten in the aftermath with the advent of World War I. Things kind of shuffled to the side, money fell out. But then the PWA picked it up, President Roosevelt approved it, and in 1938, the Eternal Light Peace Memorial, the wish of the Confederate veterans and the Union veterans who were here in 1913, was erected and dedicated on Oak Hill, north of town. And of all the monuments and memorials we have in the battlefield, maybe this is indeed one of the most significant, because this is something that the veterans collectively wanted. Not just the veterans of Virginia wanted the Virginia Monument, or the veterans of the 149th New York wanted the 149th New York Monument, or the New York State Monument. North and South, they all wanted this particular memorial. And there it stands today with the light burning atop the top. Sometimes it's passed over by tours and things like that. It's not really talked about very much, but I think the significance of it is very great because it is the last touch of the veterans of the Battle of Gettysburg. To me, it's the last thing that they touched when they were here. And that is their symbol today, and never again will this nation be torn asunder by something as foolish and ridiculous as a civil war. But we go back to 1913, and in remembrance, Robert Drummond, the veteran of 111th New York, wrote that the night July 4th, excuse me, as he's singing his tent, his train will leave early the next morning. He writes, one of the things that makes you sad is the fact that this grand body of men can never meet again upon this or any other earthly field. You note this in the tearful goodbye, the long clasp of the hands, the tender affectionate look at parting. It is the evening of July 4th, when the shade of night is beginning to fall over the field of Gettysburg. The monuments and the statues stand out like specters in the distance. The electric lights are sparkling through the tented city for the last time. By tomorrow night, it will be deserted. Silvery notes of the bugle float out over the great camp and send a thrill to everyone who hears them. It's the bugle of the regular army sounding taps upon the field of Gettysburg and speaks out by authority of the government of the United States of America. Truly, the United States. So Gettysburg is not just a battlefield to commemorate, it's also a site of reunification. And if we can't look back and take the lesson from 1913, then we've truly failed in our understanding of the true meaning of Gettysburg, the Battle of Gettysburg, Gettysburg National Military Park, and what it means to us today, and what it should mean to us today and in the future. I'm probably going way too long. Anybody have any questions? Anybody think I'd be trying glad to answer them? Thank you a lot for coming this afternoon. Thank you, Chris, for having me. Thank you. Yes.
You mentioned that all Civil War veterans were invited.
Yes.
To reunion. So did any USCT veterans arrive and come? And if they did, how were they treated?
There were a few USCT veterans that came. Gettysburg was not a battlefield where the USCT fought, so a lot of them I don't think were interested. GAR posts were integrated. There were not black posts and white posts in the north. Now in the south, they were all black GAR posts. But they were invited equally with everybody else. There are photographs I've come across of black veterans on the field. They camped with the Union vets like everybody else. There was no segregation or separation of them. I never found evidence of that. Now, how many actually were here? I don't think more than maybe a dozen, 20. But again, the USCTs were so different from the volunteer organizations. They fought on battlefields in Richmond, Petersburg. That's what they were interested in. That's where they wanted memorials and maybe reunions to happen, and it didn't happen.
What was the name of the farm that's in Sickle State at the 50th?
The Rogers Farmhouse.
Where was it?
It was on the Emmitsburg Road, just north of the Klingel Farm. It's just a site today. The original house that was there was replaced in late 1870s. Like so many in the 1870s, some of the pre-battle homes were replaced with newer frame homes because the original was so shot up, come up with poor shape. It stood there till sometime in the 1940s, I believe. It was torn down. Yes. Yes.
Hopefully somebody can answer this question. I know of two people who published their reminiscence of attending here. One was the Union and Confederate, and one was a 23-year-old young lady who accompanied 400 veterans from Maine. They each wrote what was fed to all the veterans at each of the meals. And it was, like you said, quite substantial. But in one of the breakfast meals, they were fed beef liver.
Yeah.
And I found that beef liver was fed for breakfast to the Civilian Conservation Corps camps. Mm-hmm. So when did beef liver become a breakfast meat, and what happened? Why isn't it not today?
I'll tell you, I'm thankful it's not. I know one Mr. Durfee from Minnesota wrote that breakfast one morning was a beef steak with mashed potatoes
and fresh fruit and other things. So it wasn't like your typical bacon and eggs or waffles we have today. But beef liver was often served as a morning meal. I don't know why. It kind of went out of vogue, thankfully. I really, that's something I cannot answer. I just don't know.
I just found it interesting. In the decades afterwards, we still be at that.
It's intriguing. But by July 4th, they're going to have one big meal at noon for all the veterans. And they had all this leftover chicken that had come up from Washington on trains. It was in ice boxcars. So the cooks just started cooking it, and anybody who wanted as much chicken as they want could have it. So they were just like giving out chickens. The guys leaving. Here, put this in your bag. You take it home with you. There was actually a surplus. There was $450,000 set aside for this reunion. It actually came in under budget, which is remarkable today. But it came in way under budget. It's kind of interesting. One other intriguing thing about the reunion, and I was asked this once before, the press made a big deal out of this reunion, and the press came, the Mutual News, several other news agencies all came. They covered it very well, a lot of newspapers north and south. There was a movie company that actually came and made a film at Gettysburg during the reunion. It's called Union at Gettysburg. And we have a copy of it. It's in the National Archives. They sent it to me. And it's really kind of cool. This Union veteran comes. His son is in the regular army. So they come, and he's coming. He's an old Union veteran walking around the field. Confederate veteran shows up, happy as could be. His daughter is part of the Red Cross, right? She's a Red Cross nurse. And the Union Confederate veteran will walk around the field. Well, the poor Union veteran gets heat exhaustion and winds up in the hospital tent with the daughter of the Confederate veteran, who's nursing back to health. And the son shows up, with a fresh military uniform, encounters the nurse, and all of a sudden, boom, 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 they're in love, right? So the Confederate veteran and the Union veteran start talking. They walk around the field. They go out to Howard Avenue, and they film out there. They're talking about their war experiences. So all of a sudden, they're young, and the Confederate veterans in the woods, the Union veterans over here, and they're shooting each other. And then there's a pause in the battle. Everything stops. So now they get together and they start trading and kind of eating, things like that, having a meal, talking. And now the fighting's going to start again, right? So the Confederate veteran says, "Don't you shoot me. I'm going to go back to my spot." And sure enough, that dastardly Yankee shoots him in the back. And it steals him. And oh my gosh, it's the same guy 50 years later. "You shot me in the back. You shot me." All this other crazy stuff going back and forth. Who comes to the rescue but the young soldier and the daughter, the nurse, and they save the day. Reunited at Gettysburg. If you ever it's floating around on the internet somewhere. You may try YouTube it, but it's really an intriguing little film, little digital film at the National Archives.
I'm amazed at the monuments and what Sickles is able to do. And I've recently seen he's also down in Chancellorsville with Longstreet and others. Mm-hmm. Did they have the same amount of monuments down there? Was he doing both at the same time? He's advocating here. He's also advocating there.
The New York Monument Commission was trying to mark. They were making an attempt to mark where New York troops have been on every major battlefield. The difficulty with Chancellorsville, Spotsylvania Wilderness, all these other areas, it was so vast and it was all in private ownership. Gettysburg and, for that matter, Chickamauga and a few others are very different because they became private land. Parts of them were purchased by associations, civilian groups, within the year or two after the battle or a year or two after the war. Gettysburg became the symbol of such because of the Gettysburg Battlefield Memorial Association and the willingness of veterans for them to come back here. I have a place I can put up a monument, not just where we fought at Gettysburg, but also to list all the battles that the regiment was in throughout the entire war. So while the New York Commission was very interested in marking other battlefields, there wasn't money coming out of the wazoo. Just let's put a monument at Chancellorsville, Spotsylvania, all these other places they had been. It just wasn't available. And again, Chancellorsville, so much of that was in private ownership for years and years and years. Fredericksburg, all these battlefields, because it was still being used. Gettysburg is kind of different in that while the GBMA had purchased parts of the battlefield, like the Cemetery Hill and rights of way, they really did not own large swatches of land.
If the veterans came and put up a monument, they had to purchase a small plot of ground from the landowner, which then became part of the park as the land was turned over or purchased by the government or GBMA, whoever it was, to what it is today. Even by 1933 standards, when the Park Service started administering Gettysburg National Military Park, there were large swatches of it that were still in private ownership. Anybody who studied this place knows there were private homes all up and down the Emmitsburg Road, hotels, motels, Stuckey's, all these things until just a couple of years ago. And remarkably, what we have today is a place that's transitioned very much back to its general appearance 100 years ago. Pretty remarkable. But as far as trying to answer your question, I think they were trying that much. But again, I think as time went on, the veterans' age started dying away. The interest in trying to mark all these sites waned along with it. Thank you all for coming this afternoon. Really appreciate it.
Need a Corps badge or other insignia for your uniform? Then check out the Badge Maker. Here's what some of his satisfied customers had to say. Miranda said, I ordered an identification disc from Joe and it's fantastic. He hand-stamped it exactly as I wanted. Greg said, my unit has purchased from him in the past quality badges and good service. And Jerry S. says, the Badge Maker is the go-to place for accurate replica Civil War badges. So go to CivilWarCorpsBadges.com and attach a message with your order saying you heard about him on Addressing Gettysburg.
Our hearts so stout have got us famed, for soon 'tis known from whence we came. Wherever we go, they dread the name of Gary Owen in glory. Instead, swallow, drink down ale and